With all the controversy about the TDM meta within Rainbow Six Siege and if it's good or not, everyone can agree that the 1.5 scope is a huge part of what makes the TDM meta even exist. Whether or not you love or hate the TDM meta, you're still using the 1.5 scope just to survive within it. But why is the 1.5 scope such a big reason for the TDM meta to be a thing, and should the 1.5 scope even be within the game for that reason? Well, let's talk about it. The 1.5 scope is by far the best scope in the game. It has the perfect zoom to where it's not too zoomed in, but not too zoomed out. It's right in the middle to where it hits the perfect sweet spot, making it easy to see targets no matter if you're up close or at a distance. It's by far the go-to scope right now on every gun that has it available on it. This scope can single-handedly put operators within the meta and take operators out of the meta. For example, if you look at Thorn's pick rate since she received the 1.5 scope, it has gone up dramatically. She's now one of the most picked operators on defense, all because she got the 1.5 scope added to her gun. Before she had the 1.5 scope, she was probably one of the worst trap operators you could pick. She was definitely a low tier level operator who had a low pick rate and wasn't that useful. But now that she has the 1.5 scope on her gun, she's considered one of the best operators to bring. That's the kind of effect that the 1.5 scope has within the current meta. So should a scope this powerful be within the game? Well, honestly, it might just suffer the same fate as the 2.5 scope did. While the 1.5 scope is the king of scopes right now, it wasn't always that way. Once upon a time, the 2.5 scope ruled king within the game. It was by far the best scope you could use and no one could say differently. It had the same effect that the 1.5 scope has now, where it could single-handedly put operators in the meta and remove operators from the meta just by getting the scope added or removed on the operator's gun. However, that was back when Rainbow Six Siege was played a lot more slow and tactically. Strategy was a huge thing at that time, and people played way less aggressive, so fighting at really long ranges was a common thing. But then the meta slowly started to shift. People started to play more and more aggressively, and gunfights started to get closer and closer. It turned from a game of holding long angles to swinging the enemy every chance you could get. It went from picking off enemies from a distance to fighting up close and personal. This made the 2.5 scope become more and more obsolete because it was more ideal to use the 1.5 scope since the 2.5 scope had way too much zoom for close range gunfights. Which in return made the previous king of scopes fall down to being one of the worst scopes you could use, all because people are just playing way too aggressive, so there's no fighting at long ranges as much anymore. Not to mention pretty much every gun on defense got the 2.5 scope removed from it, and a handful of guns on attack even got the 2.5 scope removed. This same thing could very well happen to the 1.5 scope as well. Ubisoft could decide it's just too powerful and start to remove it from almost all the operators on defense and from a handful of operators on attack. This way, people should just start to use a different scope, which should cause a shift in the meta, right? Well, it might not be that simple, unfortunately. While it seemed to work to stop the 2.5 scope from being so dominant, I don't think it'll work for the 1.5 scope as well. I think it'll just cause a serious imbalance in the operators if pretty much no one has a 1.5 scope on defense, but there's still a good amount of the attackers that have it. That could cause some serious problems. That will give the attackers that have the scope a clear advantage over the defenders. However, that might be a good thing. Rainbow Six Siege is currently becoming more and more defender-sided as of right now, so maybe with only the attackers having the 1.5 scope, it could cause both sides to be more balanced. That's just a maybe though, because unfortunately that still doesn't solve the elephant in the room, which is the TDM meta itself. The whole reason why people want the 1.5 scope removed is because of the TDM meta. That means if it remains in the game, even just on the attacker side for the most part, then the TDM meta will still live on. So if my idea of the 1.5 scope suffering the same fate as the 2.5 scope is not as good as it seems, because it'll still keep the TDM meta alive, then what should be done about the 1.5 scope? Seemingly the only option is just to remove it from the game, right? Well, that's where things could get tricky. If the 1.5 scope gets removed from the game, then that pretty much only leaves two options: the 1x scope or the 2x scope. Now, because of how aggressive the TDM meta is, I don't think people will shift to the 2x scope because it has too much magnification for close range gunfights. That could only mean one thing: everyone will start to use only the 1x scope, which could be disastrous. I think this because people will start to play even more aggressively than they already are. If there's really only the 1x scope available to use, then people will want to take gunfights even closer because they have less magnification than they did with the 1.5 scope. This will cause people to want to get even more up close and personal, swing even more than they already are, and push even faster than ever. What I'm saying is if the 1.5 scope gets removed, then we could potentially go from the aggressive TDM meta we're in to an even more hyper aggressive TDM meta. That's obviously not what most people want, but hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe if the 1.5 scope gets removed, then the defenders will just use the 1x scope and the attackers will just use the 2x scope and everything will just balance itself out. But who knows? We will only find out if the 1.5 scope gets removed. That's if they even remove it and don't go the route of the 2.5 scope. I guess time will only tell what truly happens. In conclusion, the 1.5 scope is the most powerful scope in the game currently and is a huge reason for the TDM meta being a thing. The problem is getting rid of the 1.5 scope may be harder than it seems, and removing it could just cause even more problems than keeping it in the game. While Ubisoft could try to do the same thing to the 1.5 scope as they did to the 2.5 scope, that would probably end up solving nothing because the TDM meta would just live on. So Ubisoft could just remove the scope, but then they could potentially cause the meta to become even more aggressive than it already is. Now, there is a chance that might not happen, but really it's one big guessing game. Honestly, I don't think there's a clear answer to if the 1.5 scope should be within the game or even what they should do with it. Really, when you look into it, you just come to find it's a huge rabbit hole filled with more questions. However, if you're someone who doesn't like the TDM meta, which seems to be the majority of people, then you'll think something has to be done sooner than later. It's just a matter of what can Ubisoft really do. That's it for me though. What do you guys think about the 1.5 scope? Should it be removed from the game? Should it not be removed from the game? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like, and if you want more content like this, then subscribe. Have a great day, everyone.